The hot chocolate was Troy's idea. Nora's was the ducks. Grant Park. Saturday, October. Troy had coffee. Nora had her yellow thermos. They were at the bench by the south fountain, where Nora had a weekly appointment with a mallard she called Gerald. Then, she tugged his sleeve. 30 feet away, a woman sat alone. Blazer, heels, a bag that cost more than his truck. Not on her phone, not reading, crying quietly, the way people did when they'd run out of places to hide. Troy almost looked away. Nora said, "Daddy, that lady is sad." End of his morning. Troy Bassett was 39 years old and had been a licensed electrician for 14 of them. He ran a 4-man crew out of a shop on the southwest side of Chicago under the name Bassett Electric, which he had started the same year his wife Karen died, not because he had planned it that way, but because grief had needed somewhere to go, and a business plan was more constructive than the alternative. He was not a large man in the way people meant when they said large, but he was solid, with hands that looked like they had been used for actual work, and a face that people sometimes called easy to read, which he took as a compliment, even though they probably didn't mean it as one. He was not the type to walk up to a stranger on a park bench. He had learned, over 14 years of commercial work, that the people who introduced themselves to strangers in public usually wanted something, and he had no particular interest in being that person, or being around that person. He kept his own company. He fixed what was broken, drove home, made dinner, helped Nora with her homework, and went to bed. It was a quiet life, and he had chosen it quietly, in the way that people chose things after grief had burned through the original plan and left them looking at the cleared ground trying to figure out what to plant next. He was also not the type to explain to a 7-year-old why they were not going to help a sad woman when they were standing 15 feet away with a thermos full of hot chocolate. He had tried once to explain something like that to Nora, something about how not everyone wanted company, and she had looked at him with an expression so gently baffled that he had felt ashamed of himself for 4 full days. Nora operated on a different logic than most people. Simpler, more direct, without the layer of self-consciousness that adults spent years building up between themselves and the obvious right thing to do. He had learned to be grateful for it, even when it cost him something. He was not the type to follow a stranger across a park, but standing there with his daughter already 3 steps ahead of him, and the woman on the bench 30 feet away, and the morning asking nothing of anyone, the calculation was simple. Some situations had only one honest answer. Nora had always known this. Troy was still learning it from her. 4 years in, he was not the type, and yet, there was a 7-year-old already 3 steps ahead of him, and a woman crying on a bench 30 feet away, and the morning asking nothing of anyone, and some situations had only one honest answer. Troy had been in enough of those situations in work, in grief, in the long ordinary middle of raising a daughter alone, to recognize one when he stood in it. Nora had always known this without thinking about it. He was still learning it from her, 4 years in, so he followed her. Nora walked right up to the woman and held out the thermos with both hands, the way she offered anything she considered genuinely valuable. The woman looked up. She was younger than Troy, had expected early 30s, dark hair pulled back, red at the rims of her eyes. She looked startled. Then something in her face shifted, some layer of practiced composure slipping slightly sideways. "She wants you to have some," Troy said from behind Nora, keeping his voice low and easy. "She's been drinking out of it, so I understand if that's a problem." The woman looked at the thermos, then at Nora, then back at the thermos. "It's hot chocolate?" "It's hot chocolate," Nora confirmed. "I picked it out." The woman reached out and took it. She wrapped both hands around it the way you did when you were cold in a place that wasn't about temperature. She took one small sip and held it carefully, like something she had been trusted with. Troy sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a full person's width of space between himself and the woman. He did not look at her directly. He looked at the fountain. He was very clear with himself that he had no agenda here. He was sitting on a park bench in a public park because his daughter had walked to this bench, and he was her father, and that was the full extent of it. Nora crouched at their feet and resumed her assessment of the ducks. After a while, the woman said, "I'm Clare." He looked at her then. Troy. He didn't add anything else. "And I'm Nora," said Nora, without looking up from the ducks. "That one's Gerald." The woman looked at the duck in question, who was investigating the shoreline with no apparent awareness of his own significance. "He seems focused," she said. "He always is," Nora said seriously. "He has a lot to do." The three of them sat in a silence that should have been uncomfortable and wasn't. Troy drank his coffee. The woman held the thermos. Nora narrated Gerald's movements in a low, steady commentary directed at no one in particular. Somewhere across the park, a dog was barking. A pair of joggers went past on the path without looking at them. The morning continued around them in the ordinary way mornings did, and none of it required anything. When they finally stood to leave, Troy gave the woman his card. He did it the same way. He always gave his card to people straightforwardly, without ceremony, because his number was on it and his number was useful. "Bassett Electric," she read. "Commercial and residential. In case your office ever needs anything." She turned the card over once, then tucked it into the inside pocket of her blazer. She handed the thermos back to Nora with both hands, exactly the way Nora had offered it, and walked away toward the north end of the park. Troy watched Nora watch her go. "Is she going to be okay?" Nora asked. Troy screwed the lid back on the thermos. "I think so." Nora nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to accept the answer for now. She went back to Gerald. Troy sat back down and finished his coffee and thought about almost nothing at all, which was the closest thing to peace he had found in 4 years. He was very careful not to think about the way the woman had looked at his card for just a moment longer than necessary. The call came Monday morning at 7:43. Troy was in the driveway, running through the week's schedule with his foreman Danny, who was holding a clipboard and squinting at it with the focused displeasure of a man who had been given too many jobs for 1 week. The number was a Chicago area code Troy didn't recognize. He answered it the way he always answered unknown numbers with his name. Short, waiting. "Mr. Bassett? This is Hartley, calling from Callahan Freight on behalf of Miss Callahan. Miss Callahan was given your card and would like to request a quote for electrical upgrade work at our warehouse facility on the south side. Would you be available for a walkthrough this week?" Troy had heard of Callahan Freight. Anyone who did commercial work on the south side had heard of it, one of the larger regional logistics operations in the Midwest, with a warehouse complex off West Pershing Road that Troy had driven past 100 times without thinking much about. He looked at Danny. Danny looked at the clipboard. "Thursday morning," Troy said. 8 o'clock. Thursday he pulled up to the Callahan Freight warehouse in his truck, which had Bassett Electric on the side in letters starting to peel slightly at the B. The building was serious industrial architecture, concrete and steel, built in the 90s to last. He had his notebook and his voltage tester, and the general sense of professional competence that he put on the same way he put on his jacket, without thinking about it. The woman who met him at the loading dock entrance was wearing a hard hat and flat shoes and a Callahan Freight polo borrowed from someone slightly larger. She was also, Troy recognized immediately, the woman from the bench. She had the same face, the same dark hair, now in a tighter configuration, the same composed expression, worn like something she had practiced until it required no effort. "Mr. Bassett." Her handshake was firm. "Miss Callahan." He kept his voice neutral. She walked him through efficiently main panel to secondary distribution boards, pointing out where the aging infrastructure was being stressed by a load it hadn't been designed for. Troy took notes and kept his eyes on the work. The secondary boards in the administrative corridor were the last stop. He crouched, opened the panel, and ran through the standard checks. Then he paused. 2 of the secondary boards had been recently accessed. The dust pattern along the panel frame was disturbed in a way that meant someone had been here recently, not for maintenance, because there was no maintenance record on the inspection sheet Miss Callahan had handed him, and the configuration of the circuits inside didn't match the load map she had provided. Someone had rerouted 2 dedicated lines recently, carefully, without updating any documentation. It wasn't a safety issue. It wasn't a malfunction. But someone had gone into a panel they had no documented reason to be in, and changed something without telling the building's owner. Troy wrote the discrepancy in his notebook without flagging it aloud. He closed the panel and finished the walkthrough. In the parking lot, she walked him to his truck. She was all business precise, composed, the woman from the bench nowhere in evidence. Troy opened the driver's door, and then said, without particularly planning to, "Nora wanted me to ask about Gerald." Something small moved across her face. "The duck. She's been back twice since Saturday." "He's still there." "Good," she said. "Tell her he seems like he has staying power." He nodded once and got in the truck. In his rearview mirror, he could see her still standing in the parking lot after he pulled out. He noted it without drawing any particular conclusion, then focused on the road and thought about the circuit boards instead. There was something wrong in that building that had nothing to do with the wiring. He wrote it in a corner of his notebook and drew a small box around it. The job started the following Monday. Troy brought the full crew, Danny and 2 electricians, plus himself, and they set up in the warehouse's loading corridor with the efficient ease of people who didn't need to discuss what they were doing. The work was straightforward. A panel upgrade in the main distribution room, new conduit runs along the eastern wall, and the 2 secondary boards in the administrative corridor that needed rewiring after what Troy had documented in his quote as unauthorized rerouting. Wendy Callahan appeared twice the first day, once to authorize access to the secondary stairwell, and once in the afternoon to ask how the day had gone. She addressed the crew collectively, which Troy noted as the mark of someone who understood that work ran on people, not just project managers. Danny told her they were ahead of schedule. She thanked him by name, which she had gotten from the paperwork, and that told Troy something too. Callahan Freight was a well-run building, which made the job easier than most. The facilities manager, a quiet man named Ed who had clearly been doing his job for 20 years and intended to do it for 20 more, had left Troy's crew a clear schedule and stayed out of the way, which Troy respected. Some facilities managers treated contractors like interruptions. Ed treated them like colleagues, which was more useful and rarer than it should have been. The second day, she was in the break room at 7:15, before the crew arrived, eating a vending machine sandwich and looking at her phone with the expression of someone receiving information that was bad, but not yet catastrophic. Troy was the only one there. He poured coffee from the machine and sat across from her without asking. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. Then she said, to the table more than to him, "Someone I trusted is trying to take something from me. Is it worth fighting for?" She looked up. "Yes," she said. "My father built it. It was his life's work. And it's mine now." "Then you already know what to do." She finished her sandwich. Troy went to work. The days had a shape to them after that. Morning check-in with Danny, work through the main panel run, lunch in the truck, afternoon on the conduit. The warehouse was the kind of space that made you aware of how much had been built inside it. The shelving systems, the loading equipment, the organized complexity of a business that moved things from one place to another and made it look simple. Troy had always liked warehouses. They were honest about what they were, no pretense about function, no apology for the work that happened inside them. By the third day, the crew had the rhythm of the job locked in. Danny ran the work zones with the relaxed authority of someone who had done this long enough that he didn't need to prove anything. Troy moved between them, checking connections, signing off on each completed run, solving the small problems any job of this size generated on its own. He kept his notebook in his back pocket and made the same route through the building twice a day, and each time he passed the administrative corridor, he thought about the circuit boards and what they meant and what, if anything, he was going to do about it. It was Nora who changed the dynamic. Ruth Hadley, Troy's neighbor, 61 years old, retired teacher, grandmother of 7, a person of improbable reserves of practical patience, dropped Nora at the warehouse on Wednesday afternoon because Nora had a half day and Ruth had a dentist appointment that ran long. Nora arrived at 4:15 with her backpack and a drawing she had made at school, a park bench, a fountain, 3 figures, one of them holding a thermos. Troy sent her to the break room with his phone and told her to sit at the table and read or watch something until he was done with the conduit run. She went without protest, which should have told him something. 20 minutes later, he found them both at the break room table. Wendy had apparently come for the vending machine and encountered Nora instead. The drawing was between them, and Nora was explaining the duck. "He has a territory," Nora was saying. "He stays on the south side of the fountain. I think he has a nest somewhere, but I haven't found it yet." Wendy was leaning slightly forward, arms on the table, looking at the drawing with an expression Troy had not seen on her in any of their professional interactions. It was open, unguarded. She looked like someone who had stopped managing her own face. "Do you go every week?" she asked. "Every Saturday," Nora said. "Dad says we can't go every day because he has work, but I think if we explained it to Gerald he would understand." "I think Gerald would agree," Wendy said. Nora evaluated this for accuracy. Then she nodded, satisfied. Troy stood in the doorway. Neither of them had seen him. He watched Wendy Callahan look at a drawing his daughter had made, and he thought about the woman on the bench, and about the circuit boards, and about the question in his notebook, and about the way she had said to the table, "Someone I trusted is trying to take something from me." He cleared his throat. Nora looked up. Wendy looked up a half-second later, and the guarded expression returned slowly, like something she had to remind herself to put on. "Dad," Nora said. She remembered Gerald. "I heard," Troy said. He drove them home that evening not by plan. His truck wouldn't start. Dead battery, jump kit at the shop across town. Nora tired, and the dark coming on. Wendy appeared at the driver's window and said she had a company car and the driver was already waiting. Troy said it wasn't necessary. Nora said her feet hurt. He looked at Wendy. "It's not out of the way," she said. They rode in the back of a car that was nicer than anything Troy had ever sat in, through the south side of the city, with the lights coming up outside the windows and Nora falling asleep against the door within 10 minutes of starting. The partition between the front and back seats was up. Troy sat with his hands in his lap, and Wendy sat with hers, and they didn't talk for a while. Then she said, quietly, so as not to wake Nora, "She draws well. She gets it from her mother," Troy said. There was a pause. "I'm sorry that you lost her." It was the first time anyone had said it to him in a long time that didn't feel like the preamble to something else. No advice, no pivot, no segue into a related topic. Just that. 4 years, he said. She nodded and looked out the window. He looked out his. The city went by in the dark, and Nora breathed in the deep, even way she had when she was fully asleep. "You didn't have to drive us," he said, when they reached his block. "I know," she said. He lifted Nora without waking her arms going automatically around his neck and stood on the sidewalk with his sleeping daughter against his shoulder. Wendy was still in the back seat, window down. "The drawing," he said. She left it on the table. "I kept it," she said. He nodded once. He carried Nora inside, put her to bed, and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a while afterward, the way you did when the night had been more than you'd expected. It was 2 weeks into the job. Troy's crew had opened a wall panel in the administrative corridor to run new conduit, the last major run of the project, the one that would complete the upgrade to the secondary boards when Danny called him over. "Something back here," Danny said. His flashlight was pointed into the space behind the junction box. Troy looked. Tucked between the box frame and the rough framing of the wall was a sealed manila envelope. The paper wasn't yellowed. The edges weren't dusty the way paper got after years in a wall. Someone had put it there recently. Danny looked at Troy. Troy looked at the envelope. He thought about the circuit boards rerouted without documentation. He pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside was a single sheet handwritten, neat small script, columns of names. Next to each, a percentage, and next to 4 of the names, a notation, in the same careful handwriting. Confirmed proxy signed Drummond. He didn't know the full implication immediately, but he knew enough about business to know what a proxy was, and he knew enough about people to know that a list of names hidden behind a wall panel was not there by accident. He photographed it with his phone. He replaced the envelope exactly where he found it. He told Danny to close the panel temporarily and move on to the eastern conduit run. He stood in the corridor for a moment after Danny left, the phone in his pocket, the image of the ledger still clear in his mind. Names. Percentages. Drummond. He had found things in walls before old wiring, forgotten junction boxes, the occasional rodent, but never anything that belonged to someone's life. He walked back to the main panel room and got to work, and didn't say anything to anyone, which was how he handled things he hadn't figured out yet. That evening he looked up Philip Drummond, the COO of Callahan Freight. LinkedIn, company website, the standard professional biography board experience, logistics background, 15 years in freight operations management. Nothing unusual. He searched further. It took 20 minutes to find it. A Business Journal article from Cincinnati, 3 years old, 6 paragraphs. The subject was the acquisition and dissolution of a logistics company called Meridian Transport. A senior operations executive named Philip Drummond had been involved in the acquiring entity. Within 6 months of the deal closing, Meridian Transport had been stripped of its contracts and its assets absorbed. 62 employees. The founder's daughter was quoted at the end of the article. 3 words. "We trusted him." Troy sat at his kitchen table for a while after he read that. Then he texted Wendy Callahan. "Can we talk tomorrow?" Not about the electrical job. She read it at 11:14. 4 minutes passed. "Is everything okay?" He wrote, "I'm not sure, but I think you should know something." 3 dots. Then, 7 in the morning. "I'll be in early." He set his alarm for 5:30 and went to bed. She was already there when he arrived. The break room, same table. 2 coffees on the table, real ones, from the place around the corner, not the machine. She pushed one across when he sat down. He put his phone on the table between them. He pulled up the photograph of the ledger and turned the screen to face her. She looked at it without touching the phone. He watched her read it. He watched her read it again. She was quiet for a long time. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Behind the junction box in the administrative corridor, inside the wall." "When?" "Yesterday afternoon. I put it back. It's still there." She set her coffee down without drinking it. Her hands were steady. Troy had noticed that about her she went very still when things were bad, rather than agitated. It was the kind of stillness that came from training yourself, over a long time, not to show the things you felt in front of people who might use them. "Phil Drummond has been my COO for 7 years, she said. "He was my father's choice when my father stepped back. I kept him because I had no reason not to, because I trusted him." "I looked him up last night," Troy said. "There's a logistics company in Cincinnati called Meridian Transport 3 years ago." She looked up. He was involved in an acquisition there. The company didn't survive it. 62 people were out of work by the end of the first quarter. He paused. The founder's daughter gave a quote to the paper. 3 words. She was quiet. "We trusted him," he said. Something moved behind her eyes, not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of someone receiving confirmation of a thing they had hoped would remain unconfirmed. She picked up her phone and made a call without looking away from the table. "Patricia, I need you in the building by 8. "Yes. Bring whoever you need." She hung up. "Our general counsel." "Good," he said. "You could have found this and walked away," she said. "Yeah," he said. She waited. "My daughter would have found out eventually. She has a very clear sense of what a person is supposed to do." Something happened in her face, the real laugh, surprised out of her, short and genuine. The lawyers arrived. Troy excused himself and went to get his crew started, because the job was not finished, and it still needed finishing, and he was not the kind of person who confused being involved with being in the way. By 9 o'clock, 3 people from the legal team were in the small conference room off the main corridor. By noon, they had what they needed. The proxy signatures on file matched the names on Drummond's hidden list, but 2 of the shareholders had been traveling internationally on the dates their signatures were witnessed and notarized. They had not signed anything. Drummond had forged the proxies to manufacture a voting majority that didn't exist, all to push through a sale of Callahan Freight to a private equity group whose terms were already negotiated. The vote had been scheduled for Friday. At 2 in the afternoon, Drummond came into the building for what he believed was a pre-board strategy session. He was wearing a suit. He was carrying a leather portfolio. He walked through the lobby with the ease of someone who considered himself a permanent fixture. Wendy met him in the large conference room. Her general counsel was there, 2 people from the outside law firm were there. The forged proxy documentation was on the table. Troy was running a final conduit check in the corridor when Drummond went in. He heard the door close. He went back to his work. 40 minutes later, the door opened. He heard footsteps heavier and faster than they should have been, and then the sound of the lobby door, and then nothing. He finished the connection he was on, checked it, and moved on. She found him in the warehouse at 4 o'clock. The main work was done. Troy was doing the final walkthrough alone. Every panel, every connection, every conduit run his crew had put in over 2 weeks. Danny and the others had packed the truck an hour ago and headed back to the shop. Troy always did the final walkthrough alone. It was the part of a job he took most seriously. The part where you stood in the finished work and made sure it was what you had said it would be, without anyone else's assessment influencing yours. The warehouse looked different with the new lighting operational. Brighter and steadier, the color truer. No flicker in the eastern loading zone. He moved through it with his voltage tester and his notebook, methodical and unhurried, checking each circuit in sequence. He was in the secondary administrative corridor when he heard footsteps behind him. She had come in through the loading entrance, still in the same clothes from that morning, blazer now draped over one arm. She looked tired in the particular way of a day that had required you to hold your face together for many hours in front of many people. She stopped in the middle of the corridor, under one of the new fixtures, lit from above in the clean and practical way that good industrial lighting was supposed to achieve. They looked at each other. "The eastern zone is solid," he said. "No more flicker. Secondary boards are clean. I pulled the rewired circuits and restored the original configuration. Everything is documented." She nodded. Then she stopped walking. She was standing in front of the break room door, propped open. On the wall above the vending machine, taped with a strip of packing tape, was a piece of paper Troy had not seen there before. He had been in this break room 4 times that week. It had not been there on any of those occasions. He walked over and looked at it. A drawing, small, simple, the kind a 7-year-old made in about 5 minutes. 3 figures on a bench, a duck in the water, the duck approximately the size of a dinner plate, which was how Gerald looked to Nora, and therefore how she drew him. Below it, in careful looping handwriting, "Good luck," and a smiley face next to the exclamation points. Nora had taped it to the wall the afternoon she visited. She had done it without telling anyone, and then picked up her backpack and gone home. Troy stood next to Wendy and looked at it. He heard her exhale long and slow, a release of something she had been carrying since morning. And then she put her face in her hands and she cried. Not the quiet, contained crying from the park bench in September that had been the crying of someone trying not to be seen. This was the other kind, the kind that meant the worst had passed, that the structure she had been holding together for weeks was finally allowed to come down. Relieved crying. The best kind, in its way, because it meant something real had been survived. Troy did not reach for her hand. He did not say anything. He was standing close enough to be present and far enough to give her room, because he understood the difference, and because she was not someone who needed to be managed through a hard moment. She needed to be given the space to have it without anyone trying to shorten it for their own comfort. After a while, she lowered her hands. She looked at the drawing for a long moment without speaking. Then she reached up and straightened the tape on one corner that had come slightly loose, pressing it back against the wall and centering the drawing carefully, the way you handled something you intended to keep. "She's 7, Wendy said, and she knew to do that. She usually knows," Troy said. The board meeting was called for the following Tuesday on an emergency basis. Wendy had spent the days between building the case with her general counsel and the outside firm methodical and thorough, the way she did everything when it mattered. Troy knew this because she told him, in a phone call Sunday evening, not for any particular reason except that she had started talking to him when things were happening, the way people talked to someone they trusted. He was replacing a dead outlet in the garage when the call came. He sat on an overturned bucket and listened and said very little, which was the right amount. Tuesday morning she presented the evidence. The law firm laid out the proxy fraud in documented detail. The notarization dates, the shareholder travel records, the discrepancy between the signatures on file, and the confirmed whereabouts of the people who were supposed to have produced them. 3 shareholders whose names appeared on Drummond's hidden ledger joined the meeting by phone. All 3 said the same thing: they had signed nothing, been contacted by no one, and had authorized no proxy representation on their behalf. The board took 12 minutes. The vote to remove Drummond from his position and refer the matter to the State Attorney General's office was 7-0. Any pending sale negotiations tied to Drummond's activities were voided in the same motion. The private equity deal was dead. Wendy's father watched from a video link on a laptop set up at the end of the conference table. He was at his house in Wisconsin, in a room that looked like a study, wearing a flannel shirt instead of a suit, and he looked older than his photographs. He said almost nothing during the meeting. When the vote was called, he sat quietly for a moment in front of his camera, and then said, "I always knew you'd hold it." Then he ended the call, because that was apparently the kind of man he was. Wendy called Troy that evening. He was at the stove making pasta, which was what he made on weeknights because Nora would eat it reliably without negotiation. Nora was at the kitchen table doing homework, which she was technically doing and also technically narrating aloud, which was how Troy usually knew how it was going. His phone buzzed on the counter. He picked it up. 7-0, Wendy said when he answered. "Good number," he said. "Drummond left the building Monday and hasn't been back. The company is not being sold." A pause. "My father watched the vote on a video call. He said he always knew I'd hold it." "Did you know?" Troy asked. A pause. "No, not always." Another pause. "I knew on Monday morning. Someone left a photograph on his own phone and texted me about it. Is that the correct version?" "That's the version I'd go with." Nora looked up from her homework. "Who is it?" she mouthed. Troy mouthed back. "Clare." Nora's eyes went wide. She dropped her pencil and pumped her fist once, silently, with considerable feeling. Wendy said through the phone, "I want to take you both to dinner. You and Nora." "My treat?" "No agenda." Troy leaned against the counter. "Nora picks the restaurant. I accept those terms." Nora, who had apparently been lip-reading, sat up straight and said at full volume, "I heard that. I want the place with the breadbasket." A brief silence on the other end, and then Wendy's laugh came through the phone, and into the kitchen, the real one, unguarded, the kind that got surprised out of her, and Troy stood there holding his phone and smiling at nothing in particular. 3 weeks later, dinner had started as one dinner, a place on the north side that Nora had selected based on the quality of its breadbasket, which she evaluated with the same rigor she applied to duck observation. The breadbasket had been satisfactory. Wendy had eaten 2 pieces of sourdough and listened to a detailed account of Gerald's recent territorial expansion with the focused attention of someone taking notes. Nora had approved of the attention. Then it had become the park. Not arranged exactly. Wendy had mentioned she'd started going for walks in the morning again, that Grant Park was on her route, that the bench near the south fountain was usually empty on Saturday mornings. Troy had said they'd be there at 9. She had said she knew, so she came. Not every week, but often enough that it had become a thing they did. She wore different shoes now on the Saturdays, practical ones, the kind you could walk a park in without thinking about it. She had stopped wearing the blazer, which Troy had noticed and not mentioned, which he suspected she had noticed and also not mentioned. The thermos still made an appearance on cold mornings. On warmer ones, they brought a paper bag with sourdough from the bakery 2 blocks from the park entrance, because hot chocolate was a cold weather thing, and they were deep into autumn now, the trees doing their October business with the light. He watched how she was in the world on those mornings. How she had stopped to talk to the flower seller near the north entrance until it had become a real conversation. How she had learned Gerald's full territorial history from Nora and treated it with the seriousness of someone who had decided it mattered. How she ate the sourdough standing at the water's edge, looking at the ducks the way Nora had taught her, not past them, but at them. He was careful. He had always been careful since Karen, not out of loyalty to the past, but because Nora's world was arranged around him in a way that made everything he introduced into it matter. He took that seriously. Wendy seemed to understand this without being told. She arrived when she said she would and left when the morning wound down, and she had never suggested anything that required a decision he wasn't ready to make. He respected that more than he had words for. On the last Saturday of October, the three of them were at the bench, the original bench, near the south fountain. The water was gray, and the park quieter than September. Nora was at the water's edge, in a conversation with Gerald that appeared, from Troy's vantage point, to be of considerable significance to both parties. He and Wendy sat on the bench. There was less space between them than there had been in September. Nora finished whatever she was saying, and came back to the bench, and climbed up between them, and looked at Gerald from above, from the bench, which was a new vantage point she had apparently decided to try. She looked at her father. She looked at Wendy. Then she leaned against Wendy's arm, and closed her eyes in the particular boneless way she had, when she was satisfied with the state of things, fully satisfied, not just willing to accept. Wendy went very still. Then, carefully, she shifted her arm so that Nora could lean more comfortably, and looked out at the fountain and the light on the water and the ducks. Troy was already watching her. She turned her head. He was looking right at her. And he didn't look away. There was nothing to say yet. There was plenty of time for that, the right things, in the right order, when they were ready. The morning was cool and unhurried, and his daughter was leaning against the arm of the woman who had been crying on this bench 9 weeks ago, and somewhere in the gray water Gerald was conducting his official business. Neither of them had been looking for anything that morning, and maybe that was exactly why they found each other.